educated in Catholic schools in Jerusalem, basically. He attended the Catholic University in Louvain, Belgium, where he received a degree in political science and international relations in 1972. In 1974, he continued his studies and graduated from the Paris Institute for Political Studies. And during that time, I should note that he was head of the Palestine youth organizations, both in Belgium first and then in Paris later. He went to work for the PLO, serving as the deputy director of their office in Geneva, Switzerland, the one that was the observer mission to the United Nations there, and later served with the staff of Yasser Arafat in Beirut, where he was in charge of European affairs and UN institutions. He later went back to study as a researcher at the Catholic University in Louvain for 4 years, and then was at the School of International Studies at Harvard as a visiting scholar. So a wonderfully interesting set of educational experiences. He was appointed as the PLO representative in the Netherlands in, I think, 1987. Served there for several years, and during that time was active in the Stockholm talks, which were the first direct dialogue with the United States. He was appointed as the general delegate of the Palestinians to Great Britain in 1990, served there for 15 years. During that time, he was, it may take 15 years to complete this, he just remarked. No, he didn't say that. But he was appointed as an international trustee of the University of Bethlehem, which is Vatican-sponsored, in 1995, and shortly thereafter was accredited as general delegate to the Holy See as well. In 2005, after those wonderfully interesting years, I'm sure, in London, where his children are still studying, he was appointed in 2005 as the representative of the PLO in the United States. And it's in that position, backed by a wonderful educational and professional set of experiences, it's my great pleasure to present to you Afif Safieh.
Mr. President, I'm really impressed you recapitulated all my itinerary without even a hint of a note. Ladies and gentlemen, my wife and I consider ourselves to be extremely privileged to be this evening with you. When we left London a year ago, a joke was fashionable in diplomatic circles, and the joke was, what's the difference between an ambassador and a camel? And the answer is that a camel can work for 10 days without drinking, while an ambassador apparently can drink for 10 days without working. Well, I want to set your heart at ease. I'm known to be closer to a camel or a moderately drinking camel. You've been told that I spent 10 years accredited to the Vatican. Also, a joke was fashionable during another period of diplomatic stagnation, which said that a Palestinian went to see God and told him, God, God Almighty, will there ever be peace in the Holy Land? And apparently God looked at him melancholically and said, yes, yes, of course, but not during my lifetime. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the intriguing title for this evening's lecture is Palestine-Israel History is Undecided. And I, for one, always tell my audiences that I've never belonged as a political activist to the optimistic school of thought that promises victory and salvation to the oppressed as a sort of predetermined outcome. I believe that, unfortunately, history is a cemetery of oppressed people who remained oppressed until they vanished into historical oblivion. And I always tell my audiences that I believe that today, in the Middle East and for the world, the moral challenge, the political dilemma is the following. Is there one people too many, this time we the Palestinians, or is there a state which is missing and needs to be created? And I always say history is still undecided, and I invite usually my audiences to help history, Mr. President, make the right choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've been posted, my wife and I, for the last 12 months in Washington, and we came with great expectations because my personal belief is that our battle for independence and statehood will be either won or lost in Washington. And we came with great expectations because I believe in the decency of American society. And by the way, we're fascinated by American society. We believe America is, in a way, a nation of nations. It's the world en miniature, every possible country, continent, culture, civilization is represented within your ranks. And one of my theories, Mr. President, is to say the following. Today, we no more live in a bipolar world. We've seen the collapse of the Soviet Union. And today, the international system is described as being unipolar, monopolar. I, for one, believe that in a unipolar, monopolar world, non-alignment should be what characterizes American foreign policy. And this is for two reasons. One, if America, the only remaining superpower, aligns itself on one belligerent actor in the regional conflict, not only does it antagonize all the other players in that conflict, but it also antagonizes, offends, alienates, and even ghettoizes a component of its own national, social, domestic fabric. You're not unaware, ladies and gentlemen, it must not have been easy throughout the last 60 years to be a Palestinian American, an Arab American, or a Muslim American because of this feeling that your country of adoption is not sympathetic to the suffering and aspiration of your country of origin. Now, let me tell you, first of all, you probably heard a lot recently with the many shallow and belligerent ideologues that are roaming around the globe that we Arabs might be inherently violent, that we Arabs with America, we have a problem of values, we are struggling with modernity. Believe you me, I'm very comfortable with modernity, I'm very comfortable with Western civilization, even though it reminds me of the anecdote of Gandhi, who once was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, oh, that would be a good idea. Well, I'm going to surprise you. I believe that I'm also, in a way, a product of Western civilization because my wife and I, we believe in the cross-fertilization of cultures and civilization. I come from Jerusalem, from Palestine, which is at the intersection of three major continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, and every dominant power and culture and civilization throughout history wanted to have a foothold in Palestine. So we grew up with this outward-oriented approach, and we have been influenced, and we have influenced probably every possible culture and civilization. And in Jerusalem, and I'm happy to see many Americans of Palestinian origin, we grow up in Palestine feeling that we are special in the sense that we are the custodians of those messages that took root and took place and took birth in our country. I don't believe in the clash of civilization. I don't think that between the Arab and the Muslim world and America and the West there is a difference of values. On the contrary, I always tell my American audiences, ladies and gentlemen, that very few Americans, very few Arabs today know that the first country to recognize American independence was not France, yes, who had deployed Lafayette and his input on the battlefield was decisive, but it was an Arab country that was the first country to recognize American independence, Morocco. And I always say to my audiences that very few Americans today know, just as very few Palestinians know, that in 1919, when we discovered that we were not going to have the independence that was promised to us by the major European powers and that we are going to have foreign domination, we Palestinians in 1919, ladies and gentlemen, expressed a preference to have an American mandate rather than a British mandate, and this for three reasons. One, your anti-colonial experience. Two, President Woodrow Wilson, who had gone to the Versailles Conference that terminated the First World War, upholding the principle of self-determination, which was music to our ears. And number three, the Presidential Fact-Finding Committee, King Crane Commission, that was sent to Palestine and came back to report to the President, to the Congress, and to the country by saying that they believed that the Balfour Declaration could only be implemented in Palestine with massive usage of violence and force against the indigenous population. So to tell you very frankly, ladies and gentlemen, On the contrary, we grew up educated to share the values and the principles of the American War of Independence, the founding fathers. And our hope is to see American power reconciled with American principles. And I always say a superpower has a choice between adopting foreign policy that makes it loved and respected, or adopting foreign policies that make it hated and feared. And to tell you frankly, today we all woke up to witness what I consider American democracy at its best with the Baker-Hamilton report, the bipartisan exercise, that group of 10 senior civil servants that have no calculation for their own personal futures except the national interest, and who are aware and familiar with international affairs and foreign policy. And I hope that the country and the government and the Congress will give really a good hearing and in their deliberations to the recommendations of that report. I always say to audiences, ladies and gentlemen, that there are two Americas. And maybe I'm taking a risk by talking of those two Americas. But I want to be glasnostically transparent with you, Mr. President. I believe there are two Americas. Yes, there is the America of the early settlers, which resulted almost in the total extermination of the indigenous population in this country. Yes, there is the America that institutionalized and established slavery. Yes, there is this America that had an elastic conception of its frontiers and expanded shamelessly at the expense of Mexico. This is, in my opinion, the reservoir from where there is sympathy for Israeli behavior in the Middle East. But fortunately for you and for us, Mr. President, there is another America, the America of the founding fathers that defied the colonial rule. There is the America of Abraham Lincoln, who took the painful decision of undergoing a civil war to rid itself of slavery. There is the America of Woodrow Wilson, as I mentioned, who upheld the principle of self-determination. And there is the America of Martin Luther King Jr., who had a dream that we shared across the continent and across the ocean. That's the America that it is our duty, we Palestinians, to address, to persuade, to convince, to mobilize for the battle, which I believe is the battle of humanity today. Because what's happening in Palestine, and I'm coming now to that, is that we are witnessing today an accelerated process of colonization of Palestinian territories 60 years after the end of the colonial era worldwide. I personally believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the real reason why the previous peace processes in the Middle East failed is that too much was left to the local belligerent parties, the local negotiating partners, to sort it out. And since we are speaking of two asymmetrical players, peace was not possible. To tell you frankly, I've been in favor of the de Gaulle formula of '67. Now, Mr. President, when I crossed the Atlantic to come to Washington, I was advised to conceal my Francophilia, my affinities with French culture, and my affection to French literature, French writers, and some of the French politicians like de Gaulle. But I'm here in front of a very enlightened segment of American public opinion, so I will take what is not a risk by telling you that I am a third world admirer of Le Général de Gaulle for a variety of reasons. But I believe in '67, because he is a statesman like they make them no more these days, he knew the pathology of conflict and the psychology of belligerence. His formula was to suggest what was called then la concertation à quatre, the coordination of the major four powers. China was not yet in the Security Council. And his opinion was that those four major powers, on behalf of the international community, will tell the regional player what the world expects from them both. I was in favor of that formula. It never took off the ground for the obvious reasons, Mr. President, that America was not unhappy with the Israeli military victory. It compensated the humiliations of Vietnam. The Soviet Union, short-sighted, like they frequently could be, preferred the bipolar relationship and did not see why they should give equal status to lesser countries like England and France. The English were unenthusiastic simply because the suggestion was French to begin with. And ladies and gentlemen, since then, instead of having durable peace, we are having a permanent peace process, which is the symptom of its failure. I personally believe that that was the major shortcoming of the previous peace processes, the asymmetry of the players and the fact that they were left to themselves to sort it out. I personally believe that we won't succeed unless we have an assertive, dynamic, visible, vocal role by third parties, by the international community. And to tell you very frankly, whoever speaks of the international community and of third parties today thinks, first of all, of the United States of America and the American administration. And I have great expectations. Now, as I told you, I believe non-alignment should be what characterizes American foreign policy. And I believe we are living today a very interesting moment where America is passing through a period of soul-searching, aware that it is of the failure of policies adopted in the Middle East, and is thinking of exploring other avenues. And recommendations that are pouring into the decision-making machinery are recommending the diplomatic avenue rather than the military option first. And I believe that among the recommendations of the Baker-Hamilton report is to tell the administration that an actively perceived role by America as the engine of that peace quest for the Middle East between Israel and Palestine is excellent for American national interest, besides it being excellent for us Palestinians and Israelis together. Now, I believe if we are left again to our own devices, we won't make peace. What is democratically acceptable to the Israelis is not acceptable to us Palestinians. What is democratically acceptable to us Palestinians is unacceptable to the Israelis. And any degree of sophisticated diplomacy will not succeed in bridging the gap. In addition, both sides, Israeli and Palestinian, are in a way handicapped by domestic consideration. Let me telegraphically take the Israeli side, then in greater detail the Palestinian side. In Israel today, the leaders of the country are, for the first time in Israeli history, leaders who do not belong to the heroic generation of the War of Independence, between inverted commas. They are of human dimension, of human size. Olmert and Peretz do not have any particular military pedigree in their CV. And in a way, that was a handicap that pushed them in overdoing the military dimension by trying to prove that they too were capable of taking decisive action, etc., until they blundered into the Lebanese conflagration that resulted in their diminished popularity and their diminished legitimacy. And today, their situation is not very stable, is not very secure, to the extent that they felt the need to introduce a third major party into the coalition, a certain Avigdor Lieberman, who in Israeli circles is known to be fascistic. And for Palestinian problem, his idea is deportation, transfer, expulsion, etc. He's known to advocate that option. I have seen in Europe the uproar and the indignation when George Haidar in Austria and Jean-Marie Le Pen scored a certain percentage in elections. Believe you me, compared to Avigdor Lieberman, they would be choir boys. So today, that's the Israeli coalition made by two diminished politicians, Olmert and Peretz, a newcomer who is feeling that the wind is in his sails and of very questionable nature. All his supporters are people who have arrived into Palestine-Israel in the 90s, coming from the Soviet Union. And I would like to tell you that 40% of those who came from the Soviet Union were not even Jewish at all, because many came on falsified papers, because proving that you had a Jewish ascendancy was the only way of getting out of the country. So to tell you frankly, a million arrived in the 90s, the most recent wave of immigration into Palestine-Israel. They became the most ardent fanatics in the Israeli domestic debate. 40% of them are not even Jewish of any inheritance. Yes, they allow themselves to speak of vital space and inferior races and all the rest. So that's the Israeli domestic arena. That's the nature of the constellation in power and the coalition in power. In Palestinian society, we also have domestic constraints. Hence, again, the need for an external initiative and not awaiting an initiative to emanate from the region. First of all, I would like to tell you that I always believed that democracy is not a precondition that is to be imposed on us. On the contrary, democracy is a Palestinian expectation, a Palestinian aspiration, a Palestinian right, and even a Palestinian duty to ourselves. And we have had democracy and free elections, competitive elections, internationally monitored elections already in 1996, in 2005, in 2006. So it was not the result of pressures on us by the neoconservatives who pretended that they want to democratize in a contagious manner the region, a region that is immune against democracy. No, democracy is our aspiration, it's our right, it's our duty. And I always say, Mr. President, it seems that the D letter can mean three different things. It can mean democracy, but it can mean docility, and it can mean destabilization. We want democracy. I believe certain circles, unfortunately in Washington, expected docility. And in Israel, certain circles are tempted to speak of democratization while they expect destabilization of the region. And I always tell Israelis there are two schools of thought in international relations. I'm happier if my neighbor is unhappy, or I'm happier if my neighbor is also happy. I belong, sir, to the second school of thought. I'm happier if the neighbor is also happy. So I always tell them, don't bet on the destabilization of your neighbors. It will have an overspill effect also on you. So we have democracy. And democracy, Mr. President, I define it as having four ingredients. It's constitutional pluralism, it's the rule of the majority, it's the respect for the minority, and it is the fact that the last election is not going to be the last election. And I am an old-fashioned Democrat. I believe that in a democracy, winners and losers have to behave gracefully. And I will glasnostically, transparently will tell you that I was not within the winning camp in the last election that took place early this year in January. The problem we are facing is the following, and the French have witnessed it, and they called it la cohabitation. When you have different elections which are not totally synchronized, you can obtain different majorities coming from the electorate. And they have witnessed it with having one in the Élysée and one in Matignon who do not belong to the same party. And by the way, today, you in America, you have your own version of la cohabitation, but I think you will be handling it beautifully, where you have a Republican administration and a Democratic Congress. So you have a cohabitation. We had presidential elections in January of 2005 that produced President Mahmoud Abbas, leader of Fatah, as the obvious winner with 63%. That would make any Western president elected blush of envy. 63% is a very comfortable majority on a very unambiguous program of peace, negotiations, the abandonment of the military instrument, etc., etc. Yet a year later, for a variety of reasons, I could come back to those reasons in the question-answer period, we had legislative elections where the winner was Hamas and the defeated party was Fatah, to which that president who was so comfortably elected a year earlier belongs. So we have today a president of Fatah, the secular national movement, and a parliament dominated by Hamas. Now, the last election, legislative, it was not a landslide, by the way. Contrary to what was said in the media, Hamas won the elections with 44% of the vote. They were the obvious winners, but it's not a landslide. Their representation in parliament was magnified because of the nature of the electoral law, where in parliament they have something around 58% of the parliamentarians. But to tell you frankly, the avalanche of analysis that emerged after that election was horrifying. Horrifying. For example, the major theme was to say the election of Hamas is a blow to the peace process. Which peace process? All serious commentators know that the last 6 years, the peace process was non-existent. And the years that preceded those 6 years, the peace process was totally unconvincing. So is this argument valid, or it's a fallacy that was propagated massively? I personally believe, on the contrary, the absence of a credible peace process is one of the factors that brought the electoral victory of Hamas. It's not the Hamas victory that was a blow to the peace process, which was non-existent for the last 5-6 years. Another interpretation, ladies and gentlemen. In international relations, there is a school of thought to which I do not adhere, but it is there. And that school of thought says that only the hawks can be peacemakers. Only a Nixon could make the overture towards China. Only a Begin could conclude a deal with Sadat. Only a Sharon could withdraw out of Gaza. My question, if I want to be a Cartesian, rational individual, why don't those adherents of this school of thought say maybe only Hamas could be the interlocutor and the partner on behalf of the Palestinians that can conclude an acceptable and binding peace? It would be the logical approach, but we seem to be always in a different special category. Now, to tell you frankly, and I do not belong to Hamas, I'm known to be one of Christian origin to a very secular-minded person, and I'm in Fatih since I was 16 years in university. So I have no ideological affinities with them. Yet I'm a Democrat, and they belong to the political landscape. And to tell you frankly, Hamas is not a monolithic movement. I don't know, by the way, any political party around the world which is monolithic. All parties I know of in the first world, the second world, and the third world are diverse, have different schools of thought within them, etc. And to tell you frankly, I believe within Hamas there is a majority school of thought which is pragmatic, reasonable, democratic, and modernist. And unfortunately, that factor and phenomenon was not sufficiently exploited. To give you an example, a week before the legislative elections, the number 2 person of Hamas was interviewed by Haaretz newspaper, which is the most serious, most readable Israeli newspaper, and they have an English edition on the internet. He was interviewed, the number 2 person in Hamas, by Haaretz. And he said 3 points that I found extremely interesting. He said, the first point, the fact that in our electoral program you don't see the mention of the total liberation of Palestine, this is not a tactical maneuver, this is a strategic shift. Number 2, he said, if we are elected, we will pursue negotiations and might do it even better than our predecessors. Then he said, when we speak of resistance after the elections, we do not necessarily mean armed resistance. Well, that should have been music to everybody's ears. Do you know what happened? The next day of this interview, the Israeli occupation forces came, arrested him for a whole week during the last week of his campaign. I went to the State Department the day after our election, and I told them, gentlemen, we have 2 possible scenarios. We either try to trigger a credible peace process, trying to involve and engage a majority from within Hamas in that process, and I believe they are there available. And that's extremely wise, because then you will have a Palestinian negotiating partner that is more representative than it has ever been if you have Fatah and Hamas in that exercise engaged. Or you can try to rob them of their legitimate electoral victory, pushing them back towards militant military options. Unfortunately, it was the second scenario that was adopted. And my hope, my prayer, is that today, when America is doing that soul-searching exercise with this report that will trigger an adult, mature discussion, I hope that this first scenario that I mentioned might be again explored with much more seriousness. Now, what is the situation on the ground? My wife and I, we try to go back to Palestine at least once or twice a year for me, once for my wife. Besides the nostalgia, the family and the friends, etc., for a political reason. I need to keep in touch with my country, my society, to remain a very representative and keep my finger on the pulse. But believe you me, each trip of that nature is for me a dip into inferno, and we need weeks afterwards to heal the scars of what we have seen. What is the situation over there? I want you, ladies and gentlemen, to bear in mind that we have lived a tragedy in 1948, which was never, by the way, recognized as a tragedy since 48, which makes it now 60 years and beyond. And we have lived that tragedy, which means that almost 90% of our society has known nothing but the tragedy and the post-tragedy era. The military occupation after the 67 war, which resulted in the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is already 39 to 40 years old, which means that in the West Bank and Gaza, over 80% of my society has known nothing but occupation, occupation, occupation. From womb to tomb, from birth to death, they have known nothing but occupation. And I don't know if people in this room have an idea of what is occupation on the daily life and the existential level for those people. I always say we Palestinians have suffered 3 denials, and all denials are revolting and nauseating. We have suffered the denial of our mere physical existence. In Zionist ideology, Palestine is referred to as a country without a people for a people without a country, yet we were there massively present and deeply rooted in the country. So we have suffered the denial of our mere physical existence. We have been denied our rights, but we have also been denied the recognition of our suffering. Nakba deniers, in my opinion, is a very revolting phenomenon, and I dislike any type of denial. In dialogue with Jewish circles, and I'm very frequently, Mr. President, in dialogue with Jewish circles since I was 16, 17 in university, I always used to tell my Jewish interlocutors, I never compare the Nakba catastrophe of 48 to the Holocaust, for the simple reason that I believe each national tragedy stands on its own, and we should not encourage ourselves to indulge in comparative martyrology. And I always tell them, anyway, I don't know of any mechanism to measure pain and quantify suffering. How do you quantify suffering? What is more horrible or unacceptable, a quick death or an entire life of subhuman subjugation and oppression? I don't know how we quantify pain and suffering, and I don't want even to indulge and touch and I always say, what I know is that we are not children of a lesser God. And I always tell my Jewish interlocutors, if I were a Jew or a gypsy, the Holocaust is the most awful thing that has happened in the history of mankind. If I happen to be an American, Native American, it would be the arrival of the early European settlers. If I happen to be an African, black African, it would be slavery and apartheid in previous centuries. If I happen to be an Armenian, it would be the Turkish Ottoman massacres at the beginning of the 20th century. And if I happen to be a Palestinian, it would be the Nakba catastrophe of 48. Humanity, and you are humanity, should consider all the above as unacceptable, morally, politically inadmissible. So we have suffered that denial of our suffering. How often have I heard, oh, compared to other sufferings, it's banal. Well, if you are a Palestinian, you might not share that opinion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the situation today. Gaza, yes, the Israelis withdrew out of Gaza, but they have transformed it into an open-air prison, totally besieged by a wall, by the way. And the Palestinians, we are not neither entitled are we to fly out of Gaza, nor are we entitled to fish in Gaza, in our territorial waters. In the West Bank, which is a minute country, by the way, smaller than the smallest American state, in the West Bank today, we are plagued with 650 military checkpoints that are totally strangulating the society and suffocating the economy. And to tell you frankly, the military value and the security value of those 650 checkpoints is nil. My wife and I in summer made it a point to test the validity, the value, security value of those checkpoints. Each one of them is bypassable with very well knowledgeable taxi drivers who know how to bypass them. Yet, in a world, ladies and gentlemen, where societies are measured by their economic performance, by their productivity, their competitivity, my society loses around 8 million working hours a day delayed and oppressed at those checkpoints. 8 million working hours are dilapidated every day in delays in those military checkpoints. The levels of poverty in my society is over 60% are earning less than $2 per person per day. And the cost of living in Palestine is very high because we are merged in the Israeli economy, and Israel is a Western industrial society, post-industrial society, I would say. 60% and over 60% are totally unemployed. And I remember when we started with the peace process, I was the one who said publicly that we Palestinians, we have suffered from the notion, the questionable notion of the promised land, and we now intend to turn Palestine into the promising land. Well, we failed in that one, and the world failed with us on that one. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I always said the fact that we still don't have peace is not because we don't know what should be the content and the contours of peace. Today, the professionals of international diplomacy, they all know what should be the content and the contours of peace. What is lacking is the political willingness. And to the many Israelis that I have as my interlocutors, I always tell them, a territory that was occupied in less than 6 days can also be evacuated in 6 days, so that the Israelis can rest on the 7th, and we can engage in the fascinating journey of nation building and economic recovery. Now, I could continue endlessly, but I would like to open the possibility for an interaction. To tell you frankly, I told you I do not belong to the optimistic school of thought in politics, yet even in the bleakest of moments, I always continue telling my Palestinian audiences that I am confident that Palestine will resurrect. And as you know, Mr. President, we have had in Jerusalem some previous experience in resurrection. Thank you.
I was told a long time ago that our representative was articulate and analytical, and the demonstration has been impressive. Thank you very much for a marvelous presentation. The floor is open for questions. Mr. Shore. The question is, and I hope I have it right, could any Israeli government really force out the settlers on the West Bank?
Sir, I believe so. But it needs political courage, and it needs international backing. And the international backing I'm thinking of is of the following nature, that the world, through its major players, today the quartet, which is made by the American administration, the European Union, Russia, and the UN to represent all the others, I expect them to tell the Israeli society and leadership that this is what the world expects from you. So that the Israeli electorate, the voter, the citizen, they know that even if they switch preference from Peres to Peretz to Olmert to Avigdor Lieberman, the world will continue expecting the same thing. And it's not up to us Israelis, depending on whom we choose, we can get away with better conditions. Today, the situation, sir, is the following. In the teeny-meeny West Bank, we have over 440,000 illegal settlers who were settled there from 1967 onwards in defiance of international law and of the international will, including the American official position. And to tell you frankly, those settlers are not recruited from within the most adorable segment of Israeli society. Even Rabin is known to have said, I wouldn't want to have the settlers as my immediate neighbors. So you can understand my hesitation on that issue. I was brought up to believe that God created men and women after his own image. These settlers, most of them have created a God after their own image, which is extremely frightening. And do you know that the confiscation of land in the West Bank often takes place with the Jewish illegal settler coming with the Bible and saying, this is my title of property. God has promised it to us. And I've never seen God as a real estate agent, and I've never seen God as guilty of favoritism and clientelism, etc. And I never accepted the notion of chosen people, be it applied to Jews or be it applied to Christians, because there was that also school of thought within Christianity that says, now that the Christ has arrived and we have converted to his message, we are the new chosen people. No, I personally believe that it's the entire humanity that are the chosen people of God, and God is not the first one to be guilty of favoritism. It needs political courage, but it needs an international firm and unequivocal message, because let me tell you, Israel is a pluralistic democracy, at least for its Jewish component. And there are 440,000 illegal settlers. If you calculate, my friend, their friends and their families, and the friends of the family and the family of friends, it makes a critical mass that might scare and frighten any politician who says, if I take a position calling for the total withdrawal of the settlers, I will fail. It will be harakiri. It will be electoral suicide in the coming elections. Except if the international community takes this principled attitude by telling the Israelis, choose your next leaders in function of what you think is their political experience or their inexperience, their charm, charisma, or its absence, their economic, social programs, but not of how much territory they are willing to withdraw from, because this is not your decision. We, the world, believe that peace is too important to be left to you to decide upon, etc. So we need political courage in Israeli political establishment and in the American establishment. And to tell you frankly, serious Israelis and senior Jewish leaders around the world always thought that there will only be peace if there is a assertive position from America. And let me quote a person for whom I have great respect, Dr. Nahum Goldman, who was for 40 years the chairman of the World Jewish Congress and the World Zionist Congress. But he was an enlightened Zionist. And in Arabic, we have a proverb that says, better a wise enemy than a silly friend. Unfortunately, wise enemies are becoming rare, and silly friends are so numerous. Nahum Goldman, sir, said several things in his writings and speeches in the 70s that I believe today are still relevant. First of all, he gave the best definition to diplomacy in the Middle East. Mr. President, commenting critically on Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy of the 70s, he said, it seems to me that diplomacy in the Middle East is the art of delaying the inevitable as long as possible. The inevitable for him being the two-state solution already in the 70s. Diplomacy, the art of delaying the inevitable as long as possible, while diplomacy should be the art of seeking shortcuts, historical shortcuts, rather than delaying the inevitable. His second thing that today I would like to mention is that he always knew that the Israeli political system will not produce something acceptable to the Arabs. And he is known to have had a session with Moshe Dayan and to have told Moshe Dayan, Moshe, the Americans give you much aid and some advice. Up to now, you take all the aid and you leave the advice aside. What will happen if America were to tell you, you can have the aid only if you also took the advice? And Moshe, with resignation, said, we will have then to take the advice also. So my hope, my prayer is that the American administration will make a linkage between its aid, which is generous and abundant, and its advice, which hasn't been that frequent recently. And that's a way for us to progress in the Middle East.
The question, the first question was simply how much does the notion of driving the Israelis into the sea, enunciated by some, complicate a solution to the problem? And the second observation was that the fault for the 48 war might lie with other nations, not so much with Israel.
Sir, let me take the second point first, and I'll come back to the first point next. First of all, sir, I want you to know, and you can check my historical facts, that the refugee problem and the Palestinian problem, which is mainly the refugee problem, meaning the eviction of the Palestinian people from their homes and hometowns and their homeland, had already taken place before the 15th of May, which was the day of the proclamation of the birth of the Israeli state and the day at which Arab countries declared war against Israel. It was during the months that preceded this date that the Israeli or the Jewish forces, Haganah, Irgun, and Stern, had already militarily occupied most of the country and had evicted most of the population. Check the facts, and I'm not afraid of any verification of that nature. To come back to your first point, sir, to tell you frankly, Hamas has never spoken of driving the Jews into the sea. I will defy anybody to find an official Hamas statement speaking in the terms you mentioned. Yes, they might speak in certain documents of total liberation of Palestine, but there is no statement or no document speaking of throwing the Jews into the sea. But to tell you frankly, the Israeli society mobilized around that fear that I would like to see dispelled, by the way, is pushing my society into the desert with the world as the impotent observer. So what is happening in reality today is the driving of the Palestinians out of their homeland, because let me tell you, the wall that is being built, snaking deep into Palestinian territory, as President Bush has said, and as President Carter is showing in the book that he has just published and he is presenting on different media and in different fora, that wall is going to be a demographic expeller of those who have succeeded to remain in the homeland. So, sir, I am in favor of the two-state solution. I'm in favor of those who say we and the Jews are, choose your words, we are either condemned or doomed to live together and side by side in this space. And I believe we are plagued in the region by having too little geography and too much mythology and theology. But we have to explore civilized manners for future cohabitation, and I'm in favor of the two-state solution. And my conviction is that there is within Hamas a majority that is in favor of the two-state solution. If they don't come out openly in support of that goal, it's because they have hesitation about the seriousness of the Israeli side. Now, let me tell you, sir, why did I believe that the world was unfair with the Palestinian Authority the last 9-10 months? They have put 3 conditions on Hamas to be accepted in the international community and the Hamas government. And to tell you frankly, one can consider those 3 conditions as fair, especially if they are equally applied to the Israeli player, the same criteria to the Israeli player with the same fairness. To give you as an example, if you check with the Israeli intelligence community, you will learn that Hamas has been the most disciplined for the last 12 months before our elections in respecting the Palestinian unilateral ceasefire. And this in spite of the fact that the Israelis never reciprocated our unilateral Palestinian ceasefire. Never reciprocated, because the Israelis continued with their policy of targeted and untargeted killings, which is political assassination and physical elimination. So Hamas was observing a truce, and Hamas was multiplying statements that it is ready to prolong that truce for years. And it was Israel that was still using the violent means and the military means, and yet that criteria was put against Hamas, which was not misbehaving on that criteria, and there was indulgence vis-à-vis the misbehavior of the Israeli side. Number 2, ladies and gentlemen, one of the criteria that was put to Hamas was to say that we need to have Hamas announce that it will respect all previous commitments taken in the peace process. I, as a diplomat, will tell you this is a fair criteria, especially if it's applied to both actors with the same severity and unequivocation. Is Israel committed to the agreements signed during the peace process? The answer is no. I'll give you 2 examples so as not to monopolize for too long the floor. The first example, in the Oslo Agreement of '93, there is a paragraph which says no initiative should be taken by any side that might prejudice and prejudge the final status talks. That paragraph, sir, was there concerning the settlement and the illegal settlements and their possible expansion. To tell you frankly, during the theoretical years of peacemaking, during the Oslo years, the illegal settlements were doubled in number, in size, and the illegal settlers moved from 200,000 to over 400,000 during the years of theoretical peacemaking. Another factor, and that would be my second and last example today, we had an economic agreement with Israel called the Paris Economic Protocols of 1994. And since all our commerce has to pass through Israeli airports and Israeli ports, we agreed with them, since we were not yet totally sovereign, that they will be perceiving on our behalf the taxes on this commercial transaction, and once a month they transfer it to us, deducting 3% of administrative fee. Never during the years from 94 until now did they automatically and routinely transfer this money. This money was constantly used as a means of pressure, of blackmail, of extortion. And for the last 10 months, they have not transferred a single penny, even though this is our money and not theirs. And there is the economic protocols of Paris 1994 to prove it. And the amount is for us astronomical. Because of the poor level of economic activity in Palestine, the global figure was, in average, 75 million per month. The Israelis were deducting 15 million to cover bills of water and electricity that our society consumes from their facilities. So it was an average of 60 million per month. Please, sir, 60 million per month for 10 months. It makes today $600 million that they are withholding from the Palestinian Authority. And in my society, as a result of withholding that money, civil servants have not received their salary for the last 6 months because we are incapable of paying the salaries of the civil servants. Do you know what that means for us? We have, ladies and gentlemen, 165,000 civil servants. If you consider that the average size of a Palestinian family is 7 persons, it means that 1 million persons out of the 3.8 million living in the West Bank and Gaza rely on their livelihood on the income of those 165,000 civil servants. And usually it's the expenditure of this million that was irrigating the economic circuit. When you dry it up, I have to tell you today, ladies and gentlemen, our society is on the verge of collapse economically, and our authority is on the verge of collapse politically. To whose interest? Because the result will be chaos, and chaos is something one wouldn't want even to hope for the enemy, if not for a friend.
The question for the benefit of the
one.
camera was, what sources do you have for your statistic of 40% of the Russian immigrants being non-Jewish? And the answer is?
So I will answer your first question now, but concerning my sources, believe you me, I did not fabricate those figures. I read on a daily basis Haaretz in the English version on the internet, and many Israeli journalists and writers, many sources, rabbinical, political, diplomatic, and secular, have confirmed that 40%. You can check my source. Concerning your important first question, I personally believe, ma'am, that history and societies are not static. And yes, today the mood is extremely depressing. The anger in both societies is tremendous. And I believe in the coming days, with external help, and again the American administration, if 3 steps are taken, I personally believe, ma'am, that the entire political environment in which we have to operate will be totally modified, and we can come back to serious business of negotiations. What are those 3 steps that should be taken, in my opinion, and are takeable without any impediment in the coming days? The first step is mutual cessation of violence. I believe in our Palestinian side there is an agreement between all the factions around Fatah and Hamas, which is a guarantee of seriousness, by the way, about adhering to a cessation of violence. Today there is an agreement with the Israelis between Gaza and Israel. And our position, and by the way shared by Condoleezza Rice, that this cessation of hostilities from Gaza and Israel should be extended to the West Bank. And it's the Israelis so far that are reluctant to extend it to the West Bank. And it's unfortunate because during the days that have followed this cessation of hostilities, the Israelis have escalated their policy of arrest and assassination in the West Bank. And our position is to say, if you continue that policy in the West Bank, then the cessation of violence on the Gaza front will be collapsing. So the first step that I recommend, and I believe is wise, doable, and possible, cessation of violence on both sides. The second step, ma'am, that I believe should be taken and could be taken very easily, quickly, in a matter of days, is the enormous, dramatic reduction of the economic impediments, which are the checkpoints in the West Bank, and the opening of the free, safe passage of communication between Gaza and the West Bank, which again the American official position supports, because in November of 2005, in her visit to the region, Condoleezza Rice even returned to the region, devoted 2 days to help us agree on that agreement of the free passage of people and products between Gaza and the West Bank. So my second recommendation, ma'am, and if adopted, it will change totally the political, psychological environment in which we have to operate, is the freeing of movement of Palestinian people and product by reducing dramatically the number of checkpoints in the West Bank and opening up the safe passage between Gaza and the West Bank. The third step, ma'am, that I fully endorse and recommend is the massive freeing of Palestinian political prisoners. Now, there was a lot of hoopla about the capture of the one Israeli soldier, and I wish that soldier to be freed today, if not tomorrow. But I want you to be aware that there are 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails. And somewhere between 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5 of Palestinian male adults have been incarcerated in Israeli jails since '67 up to now. So today we have 10,000 Palestinian political prisoners. Do you know what that means? It means that every city, every village, every refugee camp, every extended family has many more than one of theirs behind bars. And not all of them have blood on their hands, by the way. Most of them don't have blood on their hands. And by the way, I don't agree with the theory of those who have Israeli Jewish blood on their hands can never be liberated. Ma'am, if I am to apply that principle of those who have Palestinian blood on their hands, I might have problems finding an Israeli interlocutor. So one has to be flexible in that, and peace is a process of reconciliation and forgiveness. And I believe we are on the verge of a breakthrough in exchange, and it doesn't need to be in exchange, of the release of the Israeli soldier that was captured 4 months ago. I believe the Israelis will be well advised in releasing en masse thousands of Palestinian prisoners that are there unnecessarily in jail. Those 3 steps, cessation of violence, the freeing of mobility of people and products, and the release massive of prisoners, in my opinion, will change totally the political environment, and we can pave the way for more hope, and optimism will be again on the ascendancy, which I hope for, ma'am. So peace is not only desirable, in my opinion, it's doable. And I'm happy you had the last question.
I think we're very, very much appreciative, if you would, please. Very much appreciative of your evening.
Thank you.